Hey, what's up, everybody, and welcome back to That Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host, Michael, and this episode is Q&A number 95. For today's Q&A, I'm joined by fellow scientific triathlon coach Lachlan Kieran to have a discussion around transitioning from 70.3 to Ironman training and racing. But before we get into these questions, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Precision Hydration have developed an online sweat test, which is a quiz consisting of 10 questions. And the idea behind this quiz is that you can easily, in a few minutes, get a good estimate for how much sodium you lose in your sweat, and that will help you match your sodium intake and your electrolyte supplementation to your individual sweat sodium content and your sodium losses, which will be increasingly important the longer and the hotter the races and training for that matter. So in terms of Ironman training that we're discussing today, it can obviously be a massively important part of the puzzle. This online sweat test has been validated against actual sweat testing with medical grade equipment. So that's a really cool feature of the online sweat test as well. You can get 15% off your order of Precision Hydration electrolytes with the promo code ThatTriathlonShow15 on precisionhydration.com. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Roka are the world-leading manufacturers of wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses. And they have tons of really cool innovations and patented technologies in those various product lines, like, for example, the arms-up technology in the wetsuits and tri-suits, meaning that you have maximal shoulder flexibility, minimal restriction of your shoulders. And they have this even in the entry-level wetsuits. So that's a really, really cool feature, and they have many others. So go check them out on roka.com. And you can get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can get on roka.com/TTS. Now let's get into the questions for today with Coach Lachlan Kieran. So I'm back here with Coach Lachlan Kieran for another Q&A. And the question that we're answering today is from Matthias in Switzerland, who writes, what are the main changes in training when I change from 7.3 distance racing to long distance racing? Is it volume, intensity, nutrition, indoor training, equipment, recovery? Also, what do you think is the lowest number of training hours per week you have to train to finish an Ironman? And what amount of training hours per week do you think is necessary to qualify for Kona? Finally, what finisher time would you suggest is needed to qualify for Kona in the following years? Thanks a lot and all the best. So, Lucky, let's start with the first sub-questions. What are the things that change in training when moving from the 70.3 distance to long distance? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, look, I thinking about this, consider it, from an age group perspective, as we transition from 70.3 to say full distance, for a lot of age groupers who are working, say Monday to Friday, for instance, there's probably limited opportunity in the week to add volume. I think the main change in terms of volume is probably going to come in those key weekend sessions, pushing out the longer ride to, race distance. I would prefer at least a couple of times. And when I say distance, probably at least duration is the way that I look at that. Where an athlete lives in their terrain will factor in terms of how many Ks they actually cover. And similarly for the long run, I think that's probably going to be where we see the two increases in volume across the week as compared to, say, a 70.3 athlete. During the week, as I said, we're working with limited hours, so we can't just be stacking volume because, stress is stress and we've got the stress of life, and I don't think I expect athletes to be trying to get up at, ungodly hours just to try and cram in hours of training.
Yeah, that's also the main point that I have here in my notes, is that the importance of individual long sessions. So for most age groupers, those weekend sessions increases a lot when you go from the half distance to the full distance. So getting in your long ride and your long run, and even to some extent a long swim on a regular basis, I think would be the most important. What do you think about the overall training volume? Should it change, and does that change come from just a weekend increase, perhaps, of those long rides and runs, or can you actually get away with a total volume that is sort of more or less the same as you used to do, or what do you think around that?
Yeah, I mean, you have to consider the implications of increasing those weekend sessions, don't you? So that might mean that, say, on a Monday we have to tone back a little bit. And with a lot of athletes, something that I see to be quite successful is keeping Monday as a day off the legs, so to speak, with just a swim, especially through an Ironman build. And that can be hard for some athletes for sure. But as you said, that does sometimes provide that opportunity for a longer swim as well. Not necessarily a super highly stressful swim in terms of intensity, but we might use some pull buoy and some pull buoy paddles and just get volume in on that day. So, when we break it down, if we're taking a little bit off Monday, for instance, but, we're increasing the volume over the weekend in terms of net total volume, I think likely to still see an increase, and that would be expected, but it's probably not going to be hugely significant.
Yeah, and I totally agree with that. In terms of the one additional point that I have around the long sessions is that sometimes, depending on if the athlete has good sort of availability to do, let's say, a 2.5 hour ride on a weekday, I might actually do fewer sessions for an Ironman athlete in total, but and that helps us get in a sort of a medium long ride in midweek, rather than, let's say, on a Wednesday morning they have typically done a 1.5 hour ride for their half distance build. And can we get that to 2.5 hours, and then in addition have that really long ride on the weekend? That does seem to bring a little bit of extra resilience, just having that longer ride on one more spot in the week. But that's obviously dependent on whether the athlete has the availability to do that with work and how early they might need to get up for that, and so on, as you said. But I do think that even without increasing total volume, if we can have some more sessions that are slightly longer than they used to be, that seems to be a good strategy.
Yeah, and I think the important consideration there as well is, as we're kind of measuring load, if we were talking about it from something like a TSS perspective, and this is where, I see one of the failings for sure, is that if an athlete didn't have the ability to, say, add that extra bit of volume in on something like a Wednesday, for instance, what I've seen with athletes is that they'll just try and cram intensity through that midweek phase, simply as a means of building something like a TSS number and trying to build their CTL and stuff like that. And, that's not necessarily the route that we actually want to go down.
No, definitely not. And then the other variables that Matthias mentions in the question include nutrition, intensity, recovery, indoor training, and equipment. So if we tackle each one of those, I can start a bit with, if you increase your overall training volume, then that probably leads to a slight increase in overall day-to-day nutrition as well. And also those longer rides and runs, they do put an additional emphasis on your workout nutrition, plus the fact that the Ironman, the nutrition really becomes an important aspect, even exponentially compared to the half distance, I feel. So actually being really dialed in with your race nutrition becomes a more important part of the training process. So there are some changes there, I feel. Obviously, if overall training volume does not increase or only increases minimally, then the changes in day-to-day nutrition will be very minimal as well. And it's the same thing, I think, with recovery. If you increase your training volume, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to increase your recovery. For most, that's not really realistic. We have the typical sleep patterns that we have in many cases, and hopefully they are good enough. And we just have to make sure that with that amount of recovery, in particular the sleep and nutrition parts, that amount of recovery actually allows us to handle the increased training volume. But of course, generally we would assume that you're not doing any massive jumps in training volume, so it's more like a little nudge in the upward trajectory when you move towards the full distance, rather than a massive jump. So it should sort of almost sort itself out. What do you think about these aspects?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I think that nutrition and recovery are certainly intertwined. They're not mutually exclusive things, right? Like nutrition is a part of recovery, and I think as you kind of mentioned, if volume is increasing, then it's really important that we're fueling the work, so to speak. So even just in its purest form, I think maintaining a good energy balance should be probably the number one priority. And I think in terms of age group athletes, especially those who are working and have a routine, it's very easy to actually fall into kind of a bit of a deficit. You kind of have your routine through the week, and this is what you have for lunch and breakfast. And if you're not really following the fact that you're adding more load and therefore need more energy on board, it's easy over time to kind of create a bit of a deficit. So something that I'm always hounding into my athletes is that we're really making sure we're on top of that. Similarly, like having carbohydrate availability for the sessions where it's really needed, I think is important as well. And from a nutrition standpoint, in terms of race day, we need to find what works, not for 1 or 2 hours, but 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 plus hours is how long you're going to be taking on that nutrition. So it's really important to practice that through training.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and that's why I think that practicing that through training is so much more important than a half distance, because you can sort of get away with not having a dialed in nutrition plan for 4 or 5 or 6 hours in a half distance. And I've certainly done that, not having a very dialed in nutrition plan, and done just fine in half distance races. But when you're going to be out there for twice the duration or more, then you really need to know what works.
Yeah, there's a massive difference between exploding at 15 Ks as a run into a half Ironman versus exploding 15 Ks into a marathon. It's a much longer journey.
Yeah. In terms of intensity, what are your thoughts around whether or not that changes and how, if it does?
Yeah, I mean, I think especially as we get into the specific phase for a race, that we do need to dial into race specific intensities, and it's important that you find out what that is for you. If you're going to be, for instance, let's say on the bike for 5 hours, it's a much different intensity than if you're going to be on the bike for 7.5 hours. So dialing that in, I think, is important. I think it's also really important as well to keep some, let's call it race pace intensity, which for an Ironman shouldn't necessarily feel that hard within the longer sessions. So, I actually like to consider, as we move towards the race, something like the long run as a key run session. Instead of, I think sometimes what we see is, say, 2 harder run sessions in the week, and then the long run just becomes almost, an easy collect volume. And sure, that has its place in the year, but I think as we approach an Ironman, that those longer sessions and having some key race pace work in them is really important.
It's funny you should mention that, because actually the Q&A of last week, which you haven't heard yet because we're recording before it's released, but in that Q&A I talk exactly about that and some other aspects around the long run. But yes, I agree. The race-specific period, that's where obviously, and not just the race-specific period, but anytime you have race intensity, obviously the intensity is different. But I also want to emphasize that I think that generally speaking, a lot of the intensity remains the same. You will still have your moderate intensity workouts and your high intensity workouts, kind of similar to what you would have when you're doing your half distance. And the difference really comes in when we're talking about those race specific workouts. So I don't think that it changes substantially. It's just that on the 70.3 training program, especially if you're a quite reasonably fast athlete, then the race specific workouts, they can be considered, that's moderate intensity, and it can be a pretty high power output on the bike, or pretty high pace on the run and the swim and so on. So that becomes really like quality workout. But on the Ironman, especially for somebody who's going to take a longer time to complete that, it's almost it's part of your endurance training at the same time as it is race specific intensity. So in that last period where you do a lot of race specific training, then the other quality workouts you might lose one if you're training for a half distance, because your race specific training is already fairly hard. But on the Ironman program, maybe you still have one moderate and one high intensity workout in the week in the other disciplines. So that's a bit of a difference. But generally speaking, for a large part of the training, I don't see intensity changing that much, to be honest.
Yeah, I think it's really important as well through those longer sessions, as it pertains to Ironman, that you're not overshooting that intensity, because, as you probably agree as well, the difference, let's say, on the bike between Ironman pace and 70.3 pace in terms of how that's being fueled is very different, right? So it's if you're going to start pushing in that pace up to 70.3 effort consistently, it's not going to be long before you might find yourself in a bit of a hole, and that comes back to that whole energy availability and those kind of things.
Yeah, absolutely. And what are your thoughts around indoor training and equipment? Any changes there?
I think for Ironman, I mean, for most in a 70.3 as well, but really important to be carrying spares. I think, for top end age groupers and in the pro race in a half, sometimes you'll see athletes not taking spares and kind of just chancing it, but, I'd never recommend it. I think when it comes to an Ironman, really important that A, you're carrying equipment to fix problems, but B, you know how to do it. It's all well and good to be carrying tubes and valve extenders and, pit stop and all of that, but if you actually don't know how to use it, then it's a bit of a waste of time. So it's something that might take you, an hour of your time to just really tune in how to change a tube, but it's something that I think is critically important. And similar to that, just know your equipment. Like, know if you're running tubeless tires, or if you're running a tube, or you're running tubulars, and know how to fix those problems. It's easy and it doesn't really take any physical effort. So that's probably my number one thing there. Other equipment choices, I think important that you've got bottle cages that aren't just going to drop everything in them as soon as you hit a bump. How many times in an Ironman have I seen, there be some speed humps straight out of transition and people lose their bottles and decide that it's not worth the 5 seconds to turn around and get it, and then complain at the end of the race that they blew up because they had no nutrition. So, it's important to be level-headed, but also make smart equipment choices on that front.
Yeah, those are really good suggestions. And a couple of other ones that I would suggest is, I think these days it's not necessarily a problem with most devices, but actually make sure that your devices have battery lives that can last the duration of the race. For example, I know that my bike computer would not last the duration of, it barely lasts half Ironman on the bike. It's sort of, I don't know, the battery is really drained and doesn't charge fully or whatever. So the next time I go and race, I will definitely have a new bike computer whether it's a half or full distance. But that's something to think about. And also, I think on the shoe side of things, maybe these days it's less of a difference, because to be honest, I see most pros and age groupers that are looking for, at least for their best possible time, wearing some sort of Nike shoes. But maybe 3 years ago, when we didn't have these carbon plate shoes, then the half distance was a race where you could consider probably racing in some sort of racing flats, really light shoes, and that would work fine. But for the Ironman on the marathon, you would probably want something more cushioned. That might be a consideration.
I'll interject here and say socks. Find a good pair of socks for Ironman, because you're still running a marathon.
Yeah. And indoor training, I can go first here. And Personally, I am a bit crazy, although I must say I have friends that are way worse than I am with indoor training. But to be honest, I'm more than happy doing a 4-hour session on the indoor trainer. I just find it so effective, and I can have my own entertainment and so on. However, when I do get a 5-hour ride on the schedule, that sort of reaches a limit where I will head outdoors every single time. Obviously, I'm not doing all my 4-hour sessions indoor, but it's definitely something that is absolutely possible for me. So when for Ironman training with more of those longer rides, then I think that outdoor riding just becomes more a part of it. But that's probably just personal preference. It's not something that has to change. And obviously, everybody has their own individual threshold for what workouts make sense or are worth it to do outdoors versus indoors. So that's really not something that changes based on distance. I guess more so perhaps depending on what event and the type of course you're training for. Like if you're training for a hilly ride, then do you need to practice specific aspects around climbing and descending and so on? Then obviously you would choose to go outdoors and ride much more. Whereas if you're training for a flat ride with no corners, then perhaps you can do a lot of indoor training and it will be totally fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you say that you're kind of happy to do 4 hours on the trainer. I was probably there a few years ago, but perhaps I've just been in the game a little bit longer, and I've kind of phased out of that. I've certainly done some long ergos as well, but I tend to agree, with you in terms of it's very course dependent. But for instance, if we had something like 30-minute efforts at Ironman pace, but out on the road, if you're on the TT bars and you might be pushing 35 to 40 kilometers an hour, it's not always practically very safe, depending on where you live. And that's a huge consideration, right? Like, if you've got your head down and, you're looking up, but there's just cars everywhere, there's traffic lights, these are all factors to consider. I do agree that getting outside, especially if you have a hilly course, is important because it's really kind of important that you learn how to pace climbs. I know a lot of athletes, when they haven't necessarily done that, will get out and feel great on the first climb and be pushing up, threshold in an Ironman, which probably isn't really what we want to do if there's, a lot of climbing going on. So learning how to use your gears, learning how to find the right cadence in and out of saddle, these are all skills, and, they're worth developing. I also think, to be honest, there is a psychological aspect of getting outside sometimes. I think it is good. But in saying that, trainers have come such a long way that, even on something like Zwift, we can get a very, very good workout in either erg mode or not erg mode, depending on what kind of session you've got going and what kind of course you're preparing for. But look, I think the trainer is certainly an option. It just kind of comes down to how willing you are to sit there for that long.
Yeah. And the next sub question here was, what do you think is the lowest number of training hours per week you have to do to finish an Ironman?
Yeah, look, I thought about this question for a while. I think, we've kind of discussed this before. There's a difference between finishing an Ironman and kind of finishing an Ironman and feeling, fairly strong through it. So, if you were going to finish an Ironman but do the marathon in 8 hours, and you come from a swim background, so you can do the swim in an hour and probably knock out the bike in 5.5 or 6, and it's kind of a very different story to, someone who maybe is pushing the cutoff on the swim bike and therefore, is forced to, include some running in the run. I think just based on the fact that I'd like to see most athletes get in, some longer rides and longer runs on the weekend, at least, that, we're looking at anywhere from kind of 4 to 6, 7 hours just across the weekend. So, I would think that around 10 hours would be where I'd like to see most people. 8, and sure, there's people that can do less than that, but I think 10 is where I kind of fall on as a very approximate guide.
Yeah, and for me, the way I approached this question is actually I was looking at, so how did I structure my beginner Ironman training plan that I have on scientifictriathlon.com, and looking at what the average duration per week was, and that's a 26-week plan. So obviously it builds up from a lower volume and then gets higher closer to the race, but it averages 9 hours per week over those 26 weeks. So, but that's 234 hours of training in 6 months. So doing that, you will, like, let's say you do another Ironman, then in 6 months, then you will get close to 500 hours per year, which is not at all shabby. So although 9 hours per week doesn't sound like a lot, when it's spread out over such a long period, it is actually quite a lot of training. So yeah, again, I agree with you totally. You can definitely finish an Ironman on less than that, but finishing it and be fairly confident that you can finish and not having to fight the cutoffs and so on. I think that this is a reasonable guideline. And also in terms of the maximum duration that I have in that plan, I have 2 weeks that are 14-hour weeks, and many weeks in that 10 to 12-hour range in the last 2 or 3 months before the race. So I looked at actually the average of the last 12 weeks before going into the 2-week taper, and the average for those 12 weeks is 10.6 hours per week. So again, right around what you also had as your guideline for how much to train. So again, we're not saying that this is the absolute minimum, but it's the recommended amount to finish it and feel reasonably good about it.
And I like that we're kind of talking here in terms of duration. And this, something that I was considering around this question was specifically the long run. I know we've talked about this offline quite a lot, but I get very cautious with pushing athletes, well beyond 2 hours in terms of running. There's a big difference between an athlete that has an aerobic threshold at 6-minute Ks versus 4-minute Ks, right? Like, so if we're just measuring purely in terms of distance, I think for some athletes at the slower end, it can become a little bit kind of dangerous for how much time we're putting in on the feet actually running. So I do like to follow more of a duration, protocol when it comes to programming for athletes.
Yeah. And the next question that we have here is what amount of training hours per week is necessary to qualify for Kona, and what finishing times would you suggest is needed the following years? Perhaps I could start with what finishing times you would suggest is needed the following years, and then you can start with the training hours you think is necessary, because I'm sure you're aware of this as well, but I would just recommend anybody who is interested in finishing times to qualify for Kona, go and check out coachcox.co.uk. I'll link to it in the episode description. Russell Cox is a coach in the UK who actually is a past guest on the podcast, and he collects stats from all Ironman races and who qualifies for Kona and so on. So there's data going back at least 5 years, if not more. So you can check for any race, any age group, what is needed, and you can basically make an informed decision as well on which races might make sense to go to. Obviously, bearing in mind that different times mean different things depending on the course and the weather conditions and so on. But just go to that website, go to the Kona qualification tab and scroll down to qualification by age group, and then choose your own age group, and that will show you in different races what you would need. And I can give as an example, in my age group, 30 to 34, I can see that the slowest time last year that would have qualified for Kona was 10:17 in Ironman Taiwan. But obviously that's very hot, so that's not comparable to 10:17 in another race. And as a counterpoint to that, in Ironman Frankfurt, which actually also was very, very hot last year, but in that race, that age group would have required a 9:17 in the same age group to qualify. That's my most recommended resource to check out when it comes to what time is required. It's obviously so different for different age groups and genders and races that we can't really give a specific number, but everybody can check out what applies to themselves on that website.
Yeah, and I totally agree with your sentiment there. Like, if you're really serious about qualifying for Kona, it's so important to try. At least do your best to pick a course that suits you. And sure, that's not always practical. You might just be doing whatever is most local. But, if you're a strong biker, that going to Ironman Barcelona is probably not your best choice. You're going to be much better suited to something like an Ironman New Zealand. And obviously, geographically, they're very different places. So you probably wouldn't be choosing out of those two. But, just as an example, I think it's really important to try and play to your strengths. And that comes from, I think it's probably a fairly obvious statement, but just personally as an athlete, I can tell you that many times I've just gone to races without really considering that. And, for instance, racing in Asia has never really worked out well for me, simply due to the heat and humidity. So I think you need to play to your strengths and try and pick a race that suits you the best. As it comes to hours, look, I think hours probably comes second to the actual breakdown of the training. It's very dependent on an athlete. So, if I'll give you an example, I have, an athlete who comes from a fairly strong rowing background, likely has, a very high VO2 max, can push amazing power on the bike and runs really well as well. But the way that he might be fueling that output, could be very different to, say, someone who's been in, endurance sport for the last 10 years. So, the breakdown of the training there becomes really important. Similarly, you hear all these stories of, I qualified for Kona on 10 hours of training, but, there's little talk about the 20, 30 years of endurance sport that, came before that. So, I think that's very important as well. So, coming full circle, and it's probably not the answer that a lot of people hear, it depends is really the answer. But I think as a guide, in the 15 to 20 hour range, at least in the specific prep for the race, is probably a fairly good range to kind of, plan for.
Yeah. I agree. There's a lot of variability, but 15 to 20 hours would be a good ballpark estimate. But I think that obviously the variance there would be huge depending on talent and background and so on. And actually, if we were to look at how many hours have you trained in the last 5 years, then we would see a much smaller variance between the Kona qualifiers probably, because it's, as you said, what you've done in the last 30 years or 10 years or 5 years at least, that is so significant for how much you need to train these next 3 months if you want to qualify.
I mean, and you even see that, at the elite end as well, the age of men and women that are kind of winning Kona. It's not like we're seeing 19-year-olds going to win Kona, right?
Exactly. Yeah, actually a great interview that I just listened to yesterday was on the Be With Champions podcast with Greg Bennett. He was interviewing Jan Frodeno, and they were talking about the age of the podium in Kona now this last time, and just saying that actually now that we've come so far that people have such great professionals around them in terms of physiotherapy and coaching and making sure that they don't screw up their bodies totally, then actually that means that they can fully benefit from all of the base training they've put in over the last 30 years when they're 39 or 38 or 39. And that's why perhaps we might be seeing even a trend towards that age being higher than it has been, let's say 10 years ago for the Kona podium or whatever race you're talking about, really.
And I think, at an age group level, the way that comes back to it is having a long-term outlook on things. If you're new to the sport and you want to qualify for Kona in 6 months, I would probably say maybe just take a step back and have a bit of a longer term plan.
Yeah, definitely. And to me, one thing that I'm a fairly strong believer in is that don't look at the weekly hours so much as the yearly hours. That's where you start to see, like, okay, what did I do last year? What did I do 2 years ago? Obviously, you shouldn't chase hours per se, but if you're currently not at a level where you can qualify for Kona, but that's where you want to go, then that long-term approach is what you should take. And looking at the yearly hours is going to be more important probably than figuring out what is the exact number of hours I need to train per week.
Yeah, and when you consider it from that perspective, hitting those yearly hours, intensity control really comes into the fore there. So the reality is a lot of those hours are going to be kind of what we might term base or aerobic or sub-aerobic threshold.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, I think we answered this question in full. Anything else that you want to mention around this?
No, not at this stage. I mean, just on that last question, I wouldn't get too caught up in chasing specific times. Outcome goals in that sense can, be kind of detrimental sometimes. I think, if you go to the race and for whatever reason, the conditions on the day are completely different to what you might have expected, you have to be prepared to kind of throw those out the window. And, chasing times, whilst it's certainly, we've got these kind of barriers, whether it be like a 3-hour marathon or, a sub 10 Ironman, and they are great goals, but don't get too caught up in them.
Yeah, no, that's good advice. All right, thanks, Lucky, for joining me, and talk to you again soon.
Sounds good, mate. Thank you.
And that's it for today's Q&A. I hope that you enjoyed that discussion with Coach Lucky. You can find him on scientifictriathlon.com on the coaching page, and you can also find him on Instagram at LJKieranTriathlete. While you're on scientifictriathlon.com, that's also where you can find information about our coaching services and training plans and so on. So go check it out if you want to improve your training and racing. Thank you to our sponsors, Precision Hydration, that you can find on precisionhydration.com. Go and take their free online sweat test to get a hydration strategy for your next race. And use the promo code THATTRIATHLONSHOW15 to get 15% off your order of electrolyte products. And thank you to Roka that you can find on roka.com. Check out their wetsuits, tri-suits, swimskins, goggles, and high-performance eyewear, and prescription glasses and sunglasses, and get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can find on roka.com/TTS. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.